Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday. We finally made it to Friday. It's, in fact, the last Friday in July. For some reason, I had in my head that it would be fun to make reference to the fact that it was the last week of July, all week long. And now it's over. And so I don't know what I'm going to do next week, except, I guess, more mentions and jokes about it being the first week of August. I'm marching on, as usual. Time for another show, as a matter of fact. And, it being Friday, and it already having felt like Friday, 2 Fridays packed into a single day yesterday. Very busy day yesterday. Busy day on the show. Busy day for today as well. Lots to catch up on and become familiar with for the weekend. A lot of things that have been, you should have been familiar with last weekend that we will have to catch you up with. We've got a full plate ahead of us. We just don't know what's on it. That's all. As I count down to the start of the show today, let's see. Oh, what am I missing in terms of tabs being open? Yes, okay. Make sure I have everything ready to go. Justice in letting me know that everything was on the up and up and working out. Reminded me, we haven't spoken, I don't think, on the air about the fact that, Trump is doing another terrible thing. Does that, surprises no one, of course. And the terrible thing that he is in the middle of doing at the moment is hosting a golf tournament. And I'm not up to speed exactly on what's going on. It's been some time since I really I never really paid much attention to professional golf other than, hey, it's on TV and I know how you play golf. And so I can appreciate that was well struck. Yeah, good. Not a really big golf watcher on TV. Not for a while, anyway. And never really was a huge fan. But he is hosting a golf tournament at his stupid Trump Club. That's the one I wanted. In Bedminster, New Jersey, I think. And it's this new breakaway professional tour, which, if I recall correctly, is like what the LIV golf tour. I don't know what that stands for. I don't know if I have that right. But the whole thing was, and this only kind of sort of came to my attention. I think there's a pocket story buried way down deep when they first came out with this thing. And that, it was briefly, just a little controversial. And I don't remember why I put it away. Maybe it was probably because they announced early on that they would have a tour stop at the Trump Club. And everybody else was saying, no, we got to steer clear of this thing. Not only because it was a rival tour to the PGA Tour, the traditional professional tour in America, and internationally as well. But that this LIV golf tour thingy, whatever it was chiefly sponsored by or very heavily invested in by the Saudi Arabian, I guess the Sauds, the Saudish Arabian investors. I think probably the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Mr. Bonesaw himself, I am sure, is tied to the money because he's tied to all the money there because it's a monarchy and you can get to keep all the money there. That's kind of the way this thing goes. At any rate, they were very heavily invested in it, and people were asking the golfers who were agreeing to play in this tour. And I think chief among them was Phil Mickelson, very famous and widely known golfer, just saying something like, I'm being asked questions, do you really separate the fact that this is paid for by the Sauds, who, are just freshly off murdering Jamal Khashoggi, not particularly great record, let's say, in human rights, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, his answer was, hey, man, I'm just here to play golf or whatever. And then that he didn't regard it as being political in any sense of the word, which I guess was the first tip that this thing was going to end up at the Trump golf course because he was going to do the same thing. And anyway, it is in fact currently at the Trump golf course, and they are currently asking him about these things. And he's attempting to sort of duck that issue to the extent that he can do anything or cares about anything. But he's being asked specifically about it, and he's musing, about 9/11. I don't know whether somebody asked him, what about the fact that so many of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudis? Maybe, I don't even know what the setup, but he happened to offer the opinion that no one has ever gotten to the bottom of 9/11. And there really should. Someone should really work on that. It's just sort of interesting that he would say that, and of course people pick up on that, and then people rightly pointing out, if only you had had a period of, say, 4 years to have done such a thing with all of the resources of the federal government and access to everything and all the secrets that they're keeping. If only you had been able to get to the bottom of things. But at any rate, here you are cashing the check of the people at the bottom of things. Anyway, so there you have it. He's hosting this thing for Mr. Bonesaw over at his club. So now we can officially, unveil their new tagline, right? Trump National, Trump Bedminster Golf Club, where dismembership has its privileges, right? So, dismemberment, I suppose, is how we would have to say it. So we blew that whole line. Anyway, it's just sort of disturbing, but one of the least disturbing things about Donald Trump. Yeah, if he thought, he could make money on it, sure, he's going to do it. There would be a Trump National or a Trump Tower Benghazi if he thought he could ink the deal for it and make a profit. So, I don't know. No surprise to anyone, but it is very much in the news, and it's the sort of thing that you might notice in the news on the weekend and say, hey, we didn't talk about that. Why? And, well, I don't know. The answer is so many other things going on and so much other money being stolen and so many other terrible people being dealt with. It just slipped my mind until just now. Okay, let's see. Other things. There are many. What does Darwin have to suggest here? He's got this thing parked in my KITM hashtag column. Secret Service cover-up guy is retiring to go work at Snapchat. Oh, yes, that's right. America is weird, man. Did Greg mention this? I think so. And I think I laughed because I just thought it sounded so weird. You would leave the Secret Service for Snapchat. Like, all right, But then again, I did see other people making jokes about this guy just loves working for people who delete their text messages. And that's the reason that he's moving over there. What is this? A CBS News story. A Secret Service director to, quote, briefly delay retirement amid multiple investigations into the agency. Well, I don't know. I don't know whether it matters one way or another, whether he's briefly delaying any of this stuff. It's the guy's name, U.S. Secret Service Director James Murray. So I suppose the guy responsible for answering the questions about what happened to all the texts, or were there ever any texts, or what's actually going on here. And I guess the big payday is coming, because I'm sure that the reason he's moving over to Snapchat is he'll get a gigantic amount of money, much more than he ever got working for the Secret Service. And I don't know if there's any more implications to it than that. I guess I could read the article to find out. It's not that long, but I haven't heard anybody alleging that he had some evil plan to take over the world via Snapchat. But I guess we would just better make sure. There is that announcement. He'll briefly delay this thing, I guess, because, it sounds good to me. Like maybe it's good that he feels this sense of obligation to finish with this investigation. Or else he's the only one, or he thinks he's the only one who can orchestrate the cover-up successfully. I don't know. Could be some of that. In an internal message sent to staff Thursday afternoon and obtained by CBS News, mind you, this is an internal message among the Secret Service, but it's in the hands of CBS News anyway. Murray announced his decision to briefly delay my retirement and transition to the private sector in order to help bridge the gap and foster a smooth and meaningful transition for our future director. The director added that he recently spoke with Secretary Mayorkas and the White House leadership, who each agreed and extended the opportunity to do so. The note was sent minutes after Murray had informed agency leadership of his decision to stay on for the immediate future, according to 2 U.S. Secret Service officials, that sounds normal. I feel strongly about using this time to oversee and ensure our agency's continued cooperation, responsiveness, and full support with respect to the ongoing congressional and other inquiries. Doing so is critically important, and I am especially grateful for the extra time to help lead our service ever forward. He was slated to serve his last day as director on July 31st. That would be Sunday, before transitioning into a new private sector role at Snap Inc., which I guess is the parent company of Snapchat. Yeah, all right. So it doesn't really seem like nothing earth-shattering is revealed in they don't peel back, the layers here or pull back the curtain and let us know anything other than the fact that, well, I'm retiring a little bit later so that I can cooperate with the investigation. I mean, that's what you're supposed to say. So I guess well done there, because he's a holdover from the Trump administration. He's been there, many administrations. He's been there 30-something years, I think it said, and 32 years in the federal government anyway. Has been the agency's chief executive since 2019. Okay, so he was made chief during the Trump administration, and not all that very long ago. But so oversaw the agency through a record-breaking 42 protective details deployed during the Trump administration, a presidential campaign, and the COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to navigating a series of controversies. All right. So, okay. Well, I don't know. Just it did sound a little weird that he was leaving for Snapchat. That was not. I wouldn't have, thought that was where you would land. But I'd be curious to find out, what they have in store for him, and who do they need to know he would take a bullet for. I really couldn't guess over at Snapchat, but maybe people are trying to assassinate Snapchatters all the time. All right, let's see. Other things that I have put aside for your listening pleasure, or to annoy you with, depending on how you view it. Oh, this is an interesting thing that we might want to use some of your weekend time to catch up on. Let me see if I can find the note that I got. I knew it kind of got buried in my email yesterday, but a series of notes that now has come to fruition from listener Jeremy Freiberger, who had this exciting news to share with us. Now that at long last we can all take a look at it. He was part of an interview panel, I guess I guess it wasn't quite a focus group, but one of those on-screen television reports where they assemble a panel. We talked to 6 swing voters or 6 dedicated Republican voters, not in this case a Republican voter. I don't know what the criteria were for selecting these regular hardworking folks, but he was one of the members of this CNN panel, and they filmed this thing a little while ago, and then they kept bumping it, so it was very annoying to him, I'm sure, waiting for his segment to air. But Jeremy now tells us that part 1 of the CNN panel aired yesterday, although this he sent to me on Thursday, so it aired on Wednesday. Part 2 allegedly set to air yesterday at about 2:40 p.m., and he sent me a link to part 1, and I'll share that with you via Scott so you can take a look. And I don't know whether they identify everybody or not, but you can pick them out and see what you make of it. And I probably now realize, I probably should not be. Well, at any rate, we'll see. I should have looked and see, do they identify him by name? Well, luckily, we're not putting this out on such a global scale that there will be millions of adoring fans trying to find his house to get his autograph because you're so cool, you've been on CNN. Well, it could happen. We don't know what kind of answers he's given. Although the original hour-long panel discussion, he tells me, had many insightful comments from each panelist, I'm disappointed with the finished product that CNN assembled for yesterday's part 1. No surprise there, I bet. You always wonder about those things. How are they going to edit this thing? And which answers are they going to choose? So this is interesting insight into it. If you happen to have caught this segment or want to catch it now that it's out there, good to know this background on it. Instead of presenting full responses that a panelist would give to any particular question, CNN's editors cut and pasted only the most provocative comments. What do you know? Sometimes wildly departing from the discussion's actual sequence. It's good to know, though, isn't it? In the end, CNN is guilty here of going at least as much for exciting entertainment as for informative reporting. Meanwhile, I am guilty of enabling this disservice to America. Oh, don't feel so bad about it, but I get your point. Yeah, we'll see how part 2 turns out, but I'm not too eager to participate in this sort of pre-taped event in the future. And I can't blame you. And I can't blame you for kind of being excited to participate in it, the first time when it sounded like, wow, I could voice my opinion and I have pretty good ones and people will hear them and it'll be generally a service to America. And then it turns out, oh man, they made us look like a bunch of idiots. Or these guys, I could see cutting and pasting this thing and, wow. So I'm sorry it's a disappointment, but maybe you want to see if you can block the bottom of your screen, everybody, when you're watching this thing, and see if you can guess, just from the comments presented, which one of the CNN panelists is a dedicated Kagro in the Morning listener. And it'll probably be the one, where they say something like about procedure. Right? Well, the real fact is that reconciliation is used for, that must be the guy. But I don't know. Well, at any rate, I'll send you all the link. And I assume that the link to part 2 is out there somewhere and maybe even available by clicking on the link to part 1. So hopefully we can all share that over the weekend. And now the wisdom that if CNN approaches you for a pre-taped panel discussion interview type thing, well, it's up to you. Of course, you could say, no, I know you'll just cut and paste this thing into garbage that makes this all look weird. Or you may say, well, they're going to cut and paste somebody's garbage to make people look weird. It might as well be mine. And approach it that way. Okay. Either way, you certainly aren't to blame. And thank you for sharing it with us and letting us see exactly what it means to participate in one of those panels. I did some like 1 or 2 things for CNN a long time ago when, I was, I guess, fairly new. I guess it's probably about 2 or 3 years into official affiliation with Daily Kos. And they were looking for, we want one of the Daily Kos bloggers on our CNN blogger bunch. You remember that? That was never on, I don't think that was ever on CNN's on-air channel. They confined it to the CNN.com outlet. So we were online and they produced it, kind of sort of just like their regular TV show, but I don't think it ever made it on air. And, the concept, they would get 4 bloggers and they would try to do balance, two Democratic-leaning bloggers, 2 Republican-leaning bloggers, and they would debate some issue of the day. Horrible format, just really stupid, but that's what passes for news there. And of course, these slots, they manipulated in a number of ways. First of all, like for balance, they would have, somebody blogging. Well, they had, they did have me on there occasionally, and others from Daily Kos, I'm sure, did the same things from time to time. But, they'd get more mainstream-ish Democratic bloggers or people who are, like, well, he's a blogger who writes for, and it would be, while Daily Kos was up and coming and I guess becoming sort of, I guess you could describe it as corporate, in that it was a corporate entity that had lots of people writing for it. And then presenting as bloggers, we weren't we weren't shying away from the label either. But they would do things like, if you were blogging for the New Republic's blog, all these big publications that would launch blogs. So you'd have 2 staid, mainstream-ish Democratic bloggers, journalists that also wrote blogs for their journalistic outlets, and then wild-eyed, crazy idiots, from nowhere, blogging at thenaziswereright.com or whatever, and they would show up and debate things. But occasionally, it wasn't all that way. They definitely did have what would pass as mainstream-ish Republican bloggers, but they just, I don't know, they were just a weird bunch. I think Matt Lewis was on one time, I guess you would say opposite me. And that's, that was the last time I ever, I guess one of the first times I'd ever heard of Matt Lewis, I guess. I just didn't read Republican blogs. And then this is the last time I ever took him seriously. Because I think we were on debating healthcare, or talking about the healthcare debate. And he spent his time on there. And you'll find him, he's still online, he's still a prominent Republican blogger. And I think he's the one that's on Twitter with his middle initial, Matthew K. Lewis. And I mean, he spent his time on the air, shrieking, "Go Google Ezekiel Emanuel. You'll see. It's death panels. It's death panels all the way down. They want to be able to tell you when they can execute you." And we were like, people would like to have access to health care, and this will help them pay for it. And we probably wanted to be able to give them health care directly, but we weren't allowed to do that because people like Matthew over here were saying it's socialisms and you'll all die just like Stalin. And so we had to settle for, we'll help you pay private entities to screw you and give you just a little, bit of health care coverage. There's a minimum here. So it's going to improve things, and it's going to improve the number of people who have access to help with paying for their health care, so they'll probably go to the doctor more, but this is the compromise, and we'll take it. And he's like, they're going to murder everybody plus socialism. So it was really quite annoying. I think that was the second time that I appeared. The first time I went, they were very sorry they had me, and I guess they forgot, or maybe they invited somebody else for the second time. They were thinking they were going to get a different Daily Kos person, and I was the only one in Washington who would go. So, at least to this particular one. The first one, though, they had us on, this was about, 2009 or so, and this would be, I guess, we were getting the first completed reports about the program of indefinite detention and torture that had been implemented under the George W. Bush administration, thanks to that Cheney we all still love to hate, in case there's only one of them left, Dick Cheney. And that very day, or within the past couple of days, the Republicans had hit on the strategy of saying, well, wasn't it really Nancy Pelosi's fault? This is actually quite timely, because if you're new to the situation, you might say, hey, that sounds like what they're doing. Yeah, the whole thing was, well, sure, there was torture. Sure, there was indefinite detention. But what did Nancy Pelosi know, and when did she know it? She was the minority leader of the House Democrats at the time, and so therefore part of the so-called gang of, is it 8 or 4? I'm trying to think here. I guess it's... maybe it is 8, because I think it might be like the 2 top-ranking majority and minority members from each chamber, or something like that. It may have just been 4, the Speaker of the House and the minority leader, plus the majority leader and minority leader in the Senate. I can't even remember anymore. They may or may not have had deputies with them. That could be it. Gang of... who cares? It doesn't even matter. But those are the top legislative branch officials that the executive branch, when they're following laws, feels compelled, because there's a law that says they are compelled, to report to keep up to date on intelligence matters and top secret stuff, so that they can, without necessarily distributing that information any further, they can make informed decisions about, how to guide their caucuses and conferences in legislating the intelligence budget, the defense budget, etc. And so the Republican tactic here was they must have told Nancy Pelosi about these secret detention programs and secret torture programs, and she chose not to do anything about it. Of course, she was prohibited by law from speaking out about it or doing anything that would hint that she was spilling the beans on this stuff. I don't really know how you're supposed to deal with that stuff. But at any rate, the whole plan was to say, well, what did Nancy Pelosi know and when did she know it? She knew about this torture. Now she's complaining about torture, that their investigations, now that the Democrats had regained the majority, had been able to, A, uncover, and B, actually speak out about. And they figured, oh, well, she should be charged with a cover-up here, which is, of course, is so familiar now that they're investigating and holding hearings about the January 6th insurrection. They tried the same thing. What did Nancy Pelosi know? When did she know it? Why didn't Nancy Pelosi alert the Capitol Police? Why did she refuse to request that the National Guard be dispatched to the Capitol to help out? All of which, isn't actually true, and all of which, both in the sense that, no, it's not really true that she said, no, let's not have any help. And it's also true that she's not the only one responsible for security there. And Mitch McConnell would, at that time, still have been the majority leader, functioning majority leader in the Senate, and would have had half the responsibility for Capitol complex security, and also likewise did nothing or was able to produce no one in terms of a protective force. But no, it wasn't Nancy Pelosi's fault that there was an insurrection and the people there were violent. But it was very familiar to me. Anyway, that wasn't even the real point of, well, it wasn't the real point of anything. But I remember they brought us on and they asked us about all this crazy breaking news, and the Republicans were denying it left and right. And at the time, the Democratic partner, ostensibly, that I had on there, who just had her own talking points to get to, just blew the whole thing off by saying nobody cares about this stuff, and it was kind of amazing. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. Hey, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netflix Radio. I was just wondering if I could even find, I don't think it exists online anywhere anymore, but there was a time when you could find, and I probably should have saved it way back when there was actual footage still out there of at least part of the appearance on CNN Blogger Bunch that time. But yeah, there's at least some record of acknowledgement that the thing happened out there. And let me see, what else can I find? I don't think I'll ever find the tape on that stuff. But it was quite remarkable. And yes, there was every attempt on the part of the Republicans to say it was Nancy Pelosi's fault. And I think at some point I did wait until I was called on, and then I just was like, I'm going to talk for the rest of this segment, and nobody else is allowed to say anything, and that's it. Though there was this moment, when who was the person, the woman who was on with me, was Erica Williams was her name, and she was there on behalf of one of the Democratic organizations or another, or Democratic-leaning organizations, and CAP, right, Center for American Progress. And, she had things she was supposed to be talking about, and this wasn't really it. And she kind of used, it's funny, as it ends up happening, she kind of used as a verbal crutch hey, the American people don't care about this stupid debate over whether it's Nancy Pelosi's fault or not. They want to get to the substance of, but it was, they care about inflation and kitchen table issues. It was kind of bad where we were going anyway, but then the transition was botched as well, and it made her sound like, she was glossing over torture, which, really wasn't very good for her. And then she was aghast at the end at how that had come across. Even though the CNN didn't edit things per se, it was, kind of live-ish. But, I do recall that she ended up, and here it is, found a blog post, apologizing for, what did I just do? It was very interesting, because I was roundly taken to task as they clipped this thing and blogs posted it all over, and I, of course, this is one of my most pundity moments too, and I went overboard with things and drive people. I mean, I actually had turned the tables, and a rare moment in which the ostensibly Democratic representative of the panel says things that has the Republicans sputtering and denying and debating, and how dare, and you went too far, and but one in which it happens on the spot is very frequently the case these days, of course, that they're debating something that some random Democratic-leaning person has said somewhere in the past, like having a panel about defund the police would not be at all unusual, but it's kind of rare that you throw out a line in the middle of such a debate and they fixate on it and can't quite get their heads around it, and also can't quite rebut it. So it was quite an interesting and effective, I thought, appearance. I can't remember all the particulars of it, but I was certainly, kind of like, what kind of stupid question is, what did Nancy Pelosi know, and when did she know it? She wasn't in Iraq. She wasn't doing anything. Ask all the people who have been saying in the last couple of weeks that, that Dick Cheney ordered this. Ask all the people who, have been hard at work for years now, explaining why we're even in Iraq at all in the first place, and why they had nothing to do with 9/11, and we were spending all our time there. And it was really kind of crazy. And I had said something like, the worst torture scandals, we're pulling off the worst institutional torture practice since the Spanish Inquisition, and everybody wants to know what Nancy Pelosi knew about it. And the answer is, it doesn't matter, because it was being perpetrated by Dick Cheney. So I ask him. And that really got them going. They're like, the Spanish Inquisition, how dare you? And I'm like, what am I, offending victims of the Spanish Inquisition here? It was really kind of, it was real interesting. But yeah, poor Erica Williamson probably felt a lot like our friend Jeremy feels after the fact, and saying, I don't know what happened. It came out looking so bad on television. And part of that was the format. You had to fight to get a word in edgewise. What did she write here? This is from May 17th, 2009. Her blog, still there on Blogspot. What is it? A beautiful fire.blogspot.com. So the May 17th, 2009 entry. And it's titled, A Torture Apologist Invaded My Body? Kind of a question mark. So last Friday, I got a call from CNN.com to come and do a quick segment on Pelosi and the CIA, with a short pivot to Obama's announcement about military tribunals. Kind of random, since I don't work on any of the above issues, but couldn't be too difficult, right? Well, it's kind of a delicate topic. Wrong, she says. Despite my quick prepping on Cap's stance on the two issues, and all of my learned experience doing 30-second soundbite punditry, I still somehow managed to bring down my entire organization, excuse George Bush for war crimes, and overall destroy liberal politics as we know them. Well, maybe not that dramatic, but it was still pretty bad. I felt terrible for the way she did that. And I don't know. I think I said something maybe during the segment too, where she was saying nobody cares about this stuff, and I might have, I don't remember what I actually said to interrupt things, but like, what are you, crazy? You know, something, who knows whether I said, anyway. It is very interesting. The whole structure of everything was really interesting, just in terms of like, you know, so they needed a liberal blogger, so they got somebody from Center for American Progress, as opposed to, you know, crazy liberal guy in the basement.com or something. That they never let us do. But at any rate, I mean, what an approach to things. Well, we're doing this thing on the CIA and military tribunals and maybe sort of kind of about torture. I don't even think that's what they meant to do. But I think I might have said, well, as long as we're doing Pelosi and the CIA, we might as well talk about the torture. Jeez. What else could you do? But so she's like, well, and this was maybe the problem. She had to study Cap's stance on the two issues. Not that she didn't know it offhand, but that she was on there being asked to speak quickly, off the cuff, and have an argument in real time with people who were there to discuss things that were of interest to them personally. And she was representing an organization and had to give their view, not hers. I mean, she might have been on better footing if she just spoke her mind about these things. Anyway, I'm wasting your time if you came here to talk about the day's news. But I'll read a little bit more about this because, I don't know, it's Friday and it's an interesting topic, and it's interesting to think about how Erica felt here in this. She goes on to say, when the conversation veered slightly off topic and turned into a yelling match, because I was winning, about torture between two other bloggers, making it difficult for me to jump in, my talking point about moving forward and taking the American people's attention off Obama's ambitious legislative agenda, which I intended to say only in reference to the Pelosi CIA whodunit, somehow came out as the following. The American people right now are actually not interested in this sideshow in this discussion. The American people are interested in looking forward. Nobody is concerned anymore with what the Bush administration was doing and did. We decided it was torture. Conservatives may or may not disagree. None of that matters at this point in time. And then she says, what the heck did I just say? Dear God, a torture apologist took over my body. Looking back at the quote, I'm honestly not sure how I could have said something so wholly inaccurate and misrepresenting my own personal opinion and the work of my organization and the American people at that. Me, a black woman who proudly wears her Where Are My Reparations t-shirt every Black History Month? Would I really suggest that America look away from and excuse its very recent and inhumane past? I think not. And yet it appears as if I did. Being on TV is tricky, man. I must say. That's my discussion of it. I'll excuse her at this point. It was shocking at the moment, but boy, it's sometimes difficult to get your opinion across coherently on radio when it's just you, much less under the lights and on television. So anyway, I just thought that was really kind of interesting. And maybe you didn't. So maybe now it's time that we take a tour of what we had in store for you in Pocket and elsewhere, which, I don't know, Pocket seems to have gone away here. So we'll head back to this thing, and you can look for a link to the Pulse of the People segment that we've been provided here, and see a little bit of what it's like to try to appear on television and have everything that you have to say sliced and diced into something completely different. Okay, so let's see. A couple other stories I wanted to share with you. Heading back over to the Joe Manchin, Chuck Schumer, everybody else deal for a reconciliation bill. First of all, I want to point out that it's disconcerting already to see a couple of comments that were, inserted into my Twitter stream here. Where did this come from originally? And I guess I'm tagged in it along with a number of other people. The comment of Alan Margolin, who says, quoting from the New York Times, David Wallace Wells, writing in the New York Times, the deal, if it holds, is very big, several times as large as anything on climate the United States has passed into law before. just sort of talking the deal up and the scale of it and the scale to which it actually addresses some fairly serious environmental concerns, because that was getting downplayed early on, and we had our doubts. But I do note for the record, it's just, and I know this is probably in the middle of a big paragraph, the body of the article, but just to see in the first couple words of this line, the deal, if it holds, because again, Manchin is involved here. And I don't want to piss the guy off so that he walks away from the deal and the whole thing gets ruined. But of course, even if that were to happen, you would have to point out hey, this is not actually cool to have America on pins and needles at the every time. To get any sort of deal done with Manchin means no one's allowed to criticize him. We all have to walk around saying he's a god on earth, or else he'll feel not like a small person for actually telling the press, yeah, I changed my mind on the deal because somebody said something less than glowing about me. You know what I mean? Anyway, there's a lot of write-ups on it. I was going to turn around, though, and read, and maybe this I'll add to the collection. I was going to read something from David Dayen about the deal to see, because he's often quite cynical about these things, and he knows the nuances of the procedure fairly well, and knows when they're using procedure or some other legislative trick to kind of escape from doing something really hard. I was curious what his view on it was, and he wrote about it yesterday in the American Prospect. Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer have a surprise for you. So that sounds pretty good. It could be terrible, I suppose. I could see the two of them teaming up on something awful. But this says, an 18-month odyssey culminates in a smaller than promised, but bigger than expected, agreement to lower healthcare costs, tax corporations, and protect the planet. So not a bad header and subheader from out of someone who's tough to please, like David Dayen. And here's his view of things. Maybe it's yours as well. 5 years ago today, the late John McCain strode onto the Senate floor and delivered a thumbs down to the Republican repeal of Obamacare. This would be 5 years ago today, of course. This would have been 5 years ago yesterday. So 5 years plus 1 day, just to be sure about these things. But a thumbs down vote against the Republican appeal of Obamacare, a white whale they had been pursuing since well before obtaining a governing trifecta. The legislative agenda in the Trump years narrowed to a historically unpopular tax cut and deregulation. 1 year ago today, Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin signed a secret deal to deliver a $1.5 trillion reconciliation bill that would include no additional handouts or transfer payments on any health or family care policies, and investments in fuel-neutral energy with carbon capture technologies mandated for fossil fuel infrastructure, a zero-emission vehicle credit that included hydrogen fuel cell cars, with parity for both renewable and fossil fuel tax credits. Among the measures to help pay for it were a corporate minimum tax of 15%, and an end to the carried interest loophole for 364 days. Manchin went back and forth on pretty much all of these provisions, rejecting the bill outright, then crawling back to the table, going into bargaining with Schumer, leaving that bargaining, and coming back. And 1 year to the day later, we have a bill called the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. And he wasn't talking about inflation a year ago, so he can be happy that he now has a title by waiting long enough, which includes everything in that previous paragraph and a lot more on energy and climate, plus the ACA insurance exchange subsidies and prescription drug price reforms that we knew about. But overall, the bill spends $433 billion, a little over $1 trillion less than the original top line. Much of its revenue goes to deficit reduction. There is no such thing as a genuine surprise in Washington, usually. This was a genuine surprise. I had been talking to people this week who would or should have known that talks between Manchin and Schumer, though thought to be moribund, were taking place. The closest I got to foreknowledge was one source saying that they just didn't believe it. An army of reporters, lobbyists, and hangers-on didn't know this was happening. The reveal was made a few hours after the Senate cleared the Chips and Science Act. By the way, was there no way for them to work Science Act? That's S.A. Chips and Science Act. They couldn't come up with like a few more words that start. I needed an LSA in there to make it the Chips and Salsa Act. That was a huge opportunity missed. Chips and Science and Logistics Subsidization Act, right? I mean, or whatever. Maybe logistics isn't the right word for it, but come up with something else. They were this close to Chips and Salsa. Unbelievable. Anyway. You know I would have loved that. The reveal was made a few hours after the Chips and Science Act, a bill that offers semiconductor manufacturers subsidies for reshoring and boosts science programs. Mitch McConnell had threatened that bill, something highly cherished by Schumer, if Democrats persisted with the party line bill that raised taxes and boosted clean energy. When Manchin walked away from negotiations with Schumer just 2 weeks ago over those two items, McConnell let his guard down and allowed a vote on chips, which was popular with many of his Republican colleagues. Schumer and Manchin waited until that cleared the Senate before announcing a reconciliation deal with taxes and climate back in. If you told me a cosmic ray hit Washington and flipped everyone's brains, giving Schumer the Machiavellian cunning of a Republican and giving McConnell the guileless approach of a Democrat, that might have been a more plausible explanation for this display than the truth. It's a near legendary turn of events that infuriated McConnell so much he took hostage a bill to give dying veterans exposed to toxic burn pits medical care, something Republicans passed overwhelmingly just a few weeks ago. It needed a technical fix, so that's why it was back on the floor. The combination of the revival of the Biden agenda and red-faced Republicans making terrible choices on highly popular legislation is one for the ages. And you doubtless heard, by the way, side note to this whole story was everybody lost their mind over the Republicans picking the bill that they chose to hold hostage was veterans' health care. And of course, Jon Stewart came out of his retirement to scream about it, not on TV, and during a show, but that's what he's been doing with his time. It's quite admirable what he's been doing with his time, lobbying for healthcare for, among them, veterans who were exposed to these burn pits, but also like 9/11 first responders who worked cleaning up the wreckage of the World Trade Center who were supposed to be guaranteed care for the various maladies that arose from that and that Republicans have blocked in the past. And it's kind of been his thing. But yes, he got all the attention yesterday and well worth it, really. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that at all. Although I do wonder how up to speed he is on just how cruel Republicans really are. I mean, I guess you can live your life in retirement, but had he made such a point of saying, I just wasn't so prepared for the cruelty here. And it was like there was a whole meme about that. There was a whole piece. Adam Serwer explained it to everybody why they were so cruel. Did you really miss that? Or was it just a rhetorical thing? I mean, I don't know. I was a little bit taken aback by that. But at any rate, back to David Dayen's assessment of what's going on here. We'll get to the details, which are critical, and the lingering opportunities for failure, which are real, in a minute. But in the interest of full disclosure, I personally thought it was no longer worth bothering with Manchin anymore after he walked away yet again and offered only the ACA and drug pricing remnants as what he would accept. Time and again in this interminable process, Manchin was asked what he could accept by Schumer, by Biden, and he'd just change his mind from day to day and week to week. It was impossible to get a straight answer, or one that stuck for more than a day or so, and I thought that it was time to cut bait. On that point, I will say this. That's what made it so infuriating, of course, for a number of reasons. Not just, facially, this guy won't be pinned down. He won't say what he wants. But in the middle of all of it, of course, he's saying, well, I'll never vote to get rid of the filibuster because the filibuster is so super important for, it was interesting to me, he was so super important for working out compromise and for stability in government from year to year, from day to day. You know, if you just had wild swings with a majority and you could change the law willy-nilly every couple of years, whenever you garnered a majority, why, how could you do anything? Of course, that was the actual design of things. You were supposed to be able to govern with a majority. But for a guy who was so into stability and compromise, the guy never took the same position 2 days in a row on anything. Where's the stability in that? And compromise. How do you compromise with somebody who changes his mind and walks away every 5 minutes? But, you know, if the logical consistency was what we were after, you know, or what he was after, we'd have a different guy in front of us. Anyway, back again to the written narrative here. So David says, I thought it was time to cut bait, but Manchin did not. According to his interview with Politico last night, it took him all of 4 days after killing the deal to ask Schumer to restart it. What happened in that time? Manchin was clearly bothered by being blamed by everyone as the man who let the Biden agenda die and the planet burn. The very next day, he went on local radio and insisted he hadn't ended anything, that he just wanted to see the July inflation numbers, which won't be out, by the way, for a couple more weeks, so he still hasn't seen them, but yet made a deal. Good to note. He was attacked in op-eds that detailed what Joe Manchin cost us. That's the title of the piece linked here, written by a lead technical advisor to the Democrats on climate policy. In news stories, it made very clear who was responsible. Green groups, and particularly blue-green labor environment groups, were insistent. Larry Summers told him in a meeting that his rationale that climate investment and tax increases were inflationary was nonsense. Well, good. I'm glad somebody finally told him that he would actually believe. Now, I was calling out Manchin's disingenuousness on inflation and public investment as far back as last September. But Joe Manchin isn't supposed to listen to someone like me. His Achilles heel was elite accountability. He didn't want to be targeted by elites as the bad guy, the man who dashed Democratic hopes alone, by himself. Past wavering from Manchin had some elite buy-in, that he was just mad about gimmicks in the spending package, or that the inflation claims had some validity. That was not the case here. And Manchin wilted under that pressure. There was an inside-outside game that succeeded. I'm so glad he came around back to that term, too, because I could see it coming. If he didn't say it, I was gonna. You gotta find the pressure point that works and work with the people who can exert that pressure. There's inside pressure and there's outside pressure. Some people are more responsive to one than the other. His is inside pressure, and you're outside? Fine. Find the insiders that you do have pressure points with from the outside and say, you need to apply pressure from the inside, or else we won't stop applying pressure to you from the outside that you care about. Anyway, the irony is that many, many, many millions of dollars were spent trying to prop up Build Back Better in very traditional ways, when all that was needed was a prime placement in the op-ed pages that Manchin reads to make him uncomfortable. Now, all that said, what's in the bill, I guess we'll say, and was it worth the agita? The healthcare piece has already been covered, and he links to pieces doing just that, extending the subsidies that make insurance affordable in the Affordable Care Act for 3 years beyond the end of this presidency, which is important, combined with an exceedingly modest drug price reform that still yields $288 billion in Medicare savings and more for individual seniors, is fine. The Democrats should find a way to get insulin back into the mix rather than leaving it out, so a bipartisan bill can fail. The tax measures are simple. There's a corporate alternative minimum tax for companies with more than $1 billion in annual profit, based loosely on Elizabeth Warren's book profits tax from the 2020 campaign. Book profits? Okay. Which derive profit from financial statements to investors, not deduction-heavy tax filings. However, it seems like some credits will be able to count against profits, meaning more savings for corporations. There's also an $80 billion investment in the IRS that CBO believes will raise $124 billion in revenue on net. The Biden administration thinks it will be much higher. And a tweak, not a closure to the carried interest loophole. As Victor Fleischer explains, that tweak really just extends the holding period where income is treated as capital gains with a lower tax rate from 3 to 5 years. So if a private equity fund owns an asset for more than 5 years before selling, they get a lower tax rate. Often portfolio companies are held for longer than that. Regulations could strengthen this, but the tweak only adds about $14 billion over 10 years. So you could easily see it having been put in so it can be taken out later. That could be true. There's also a nice $15 million pilot program to study a direct e-file tax return system administered by the government instead of private tax preparers like Intuit. The administration has a keen interest in that one. As for the climate and energy measures, you will hear a lot that this is the largest climate action taken by the U.S. government in history. Those statements often tell you nothing because it's a compared to what scenario. On its own terms, this narrow energy investment from $550 billion in the initial Build Back Better Act to $369 billion through a climate bank and a climate accelerator could allow for another $290 billion in investment from the private sector. This is mostly achieved through scaling back the credits. Included in that number is an all-of-the-above energy strategy with incentives for fossil fuel production, it's true, with carbon capture attached, offshore oil and gas, but this time with a larger royalty payment requirement, biofuel production, and more. This was, of course, the only way to get Manchin's buy-in, a trade of sustaining carbon emissions, hopefully slightly cleaner ones, for the green transition. All right, and he continues here, I don't have a full breakdown of how much that $369 billion is for clean tech, but there are hundreds of billions of dollars enumerated in the top line summary, and that doesn't include the electric vehicle benefit, which is $4,500 for used vehicles and $7,500 for new ones, up to fixed income limits and available at the point of sale. So pretty good overall. Other things climate hawks have pointed out include $60 billion in environmental justice provisions like neighborhood block grants, along with port pollution reduction, manufacturing tax credits for renewables, etc., etc. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show. Let's continue on then with David Dayen's summary of what's going on. He touches on a little bit of everything in here, and I didn't want to, etc., some of the environmental provisions, because that's of chief importance to some of the folks who are interested in this package. What do they actually have, and where do we leave off here? Other things climate hawks have pointed to include $60 billion in environmental justice provisions, parentheses, neighborhood block grants, along with port pollution reduction. Also in there, manufacturing tax credits for renewables, energy efficiency subsidies, a methane leakage fee, and $5 billion in grants to utilities to decarbonize, as well as a direct pay credit for public power facilities. Now, it's not all roses, he says. There's a weird assist to Canada and Mexico, weakening Buy American standards by creating a North American vehicle assembly credit. The $500 million for the Defense Production Act for heat pumps and minerals needed in the green transition seems quite low, but there is enough investment here to accelerate the country's energy mix. Overall, the claim is that the bill will reduce emissions by 40% by 2030. This is roughly 4/5 of what the original BBB did, though the money available is much lower than that, so seeing some independent modeling would be useful. Manchin also secured promise from leadership for unspecified permitting reform by the end of September. This is apparently mainly so the natural gas Mountain Valley pipeline that runs through West Virginia can get approved. This creates an interesting new two-track strategy where Manchin wants the thing that will come later, permitting, instead of the thing that will come first, the Inflation Reduction Act. Progressives could certainly stiff Manchin on the permit stuff, though they'd be under pressure not to, and Republicans could vote to deregulate permitting and make progressives irrelevant. As ever, it's not over. Schumer wants to put this on the floor next week. The measures were all things Kyrsten Sinema previously supported, but she was blindsided by the deal, apparently, and there's a link here to, I guess, substantiate that, but it's from the Wall Street Journal, so I can't read it. Anyway, she was apparently blindsided by the deal and hasn't firmly said she's on board. Bob Menendez, who'd been a quiet problem on several elements of the bill, got louder on Wednesday, saying that the restoration of the state and local tax deduction, the SALT deduction, state and local tax, should get into the final version. Other SALT fans lurk in the House, where Nancy Pelosi has only 4 votes to spare, but they were less insistent than Menendez. It's hard to predict anything in this situation anymore, but the potential holdouts are much more tied to the Democratic establishment structure than Manchin, so the odds lean toward it working out, though not necessarily sharply. So, what's the final verdict? It's nothing short of a miracle that Manchin came back to the bargaining table, thanks to an inside-outside game that was one of the few examples of smart tactical strategy in the past 2 years. The result is about 1/9 of the spending and less than half of the revenue from the initial Biden agenda vision, but all that spending couldn't carry its own weight. As I said last October in the New York Times, it would be far superior to do a few less things and do them well. Laying out a climate, healthcare, and tax bill in March of 2021 would have saved a year plus of heartache that ruined Democratic approval ratings and created a sense of futility. Squishing the entire agenda into one bill and significantly worsening those pieces so that they could fit was also a bad idea. This isn't a perfect one either. It is what the system could bear, and it got the big thing, a plan to protect the planet from the worst ravages of global heating, about 80% right. So that's an interesting take all by itself. In addition, the piece that we mentioned just before reading David's, whose comment was it that we were reading? I'm going to have to scroll back down to find it again. But, Alan Margolin tweeting his quote from this David Wallace Wells piece in the New York Times. This, I think, is an important part of it, too. And it's not necessarily where I was going to go at all, but now that we're on the subject, I think it's important when we're talking about the strategy here, the inside-outside game, etc. This is an interesting and intriguing title. In compromise, the climate left may be vindicated. What do you think? What do we make of this? Let's read through it. The deal, if it holds, I guess it wasn't buried in a lot of verbiage, it was right up at the top. The deal, if it holds, is very big, several times as large as anything on climate the United States has passed into law before. David told you we would hear that. The architects and supporters of the $369 billion in climate and clean energy provisions in Joe Manchin's Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, announced Wednesday, are already calculating that it could reduce American carbon emissions by 40% compared with 2005 levels by 2030. That's close enough to President Biden's pledge of 50% that exhausted advocates seem prepared to count it as a victory, if a somewhat mixed one, that still falls short of the demands of scientists and the Paris Agreement. But hundreds of billions in spending and hundreds of billions more in loans do add up. This is quite a reversal. As recently as a week ago, postmortems were being written about not just the failure of climate legislation under Biden, but also the failure of the president's entire once ambitious domestic policy agenda. The finger-pointing autopsies fell into 2 predictably defined groups. One from the climate left faulted Manchin and the influence of the fossil fuel business. The other, from the liberal establishment, faulted the climate left for its hardline rhetoric and political naivete. This bill is a compromise, obviously and outwardly. It is also a historic achievement, one might even say an historic achievement, for the climate left, and a tribute to both its moral fervor and its political realism. Congratulations on getting that line into the paper, guys. Climate is a top-shelf political concern because it has been pushed there by those who care most. It is now on the verge of being addressed at scale because that push appears to have worked. This compliment is not contingent, although the story will be much more heroic if this bill or something like it passes into law. The achievement is already heroic by bringing such legislation in this country even this close. In less than 5 years, a new generation of activists and aligned technocrats has taken climate action from the don't go there zone of American politics and helped place it at the very center of the Democratic agenda, persuading an old guard centrist septuagenarian, Biden, to make a New Deal scale green investment the focus of his presidential campaign platform and his top policy priority once in office. And let's not leave out of this. There it is. It's down here. Okay, David's got it covered. I'll just keep reading. I was going to make a comment, but he makes it in just a second. Ready? This, despite the generation of conventional wisdom that the issue was electorally fraught and legislatively doomed. Now they find themselves pushing a recognizable iteration of that agenda. Retooled and whittled down, yes, but still unthinkably large by the standards of previous administrations, plausibly forward into law. It has been less than 4 years since the most outspoken of the new activist groups, the Sunrise Movement, even announced itself, protesting with Representative-elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the office of Nancy Pelosi, who later seemed to diminish the protesters' ambition as the, quote, green dream or whatever. That was really kind of a low point, actually, for her and PR, if you ask me. Yeah, that was like, come on. I mean, you know that they're calling it the Green New Deal, and they were calling it that so that you would be able to remember what they were talking about, New Deal. And, it was actually quite ridiculous that she did that, and one of the things with which I was most disappointed. But I'm glad that David brought it up here and mentioned it, because I was going to say, it wasn't that long ago that she was pretending never to have even heard of the thing. Anyway, if you believe that climate change is a boutique issue prioritized only by out-of-touch liberal elites, as one poll found, then this bill, should it pass, represents a political achievement of astonishing magnitude, the triumph of a moral crusade against long odds. If you don't, that is, if you believe there is quite a lot of public support for climate action, as other polls suggest, then this bill marks the success of outsider activists in holding establishment forces to account, both to their own rhetoric and to the demands of their voters. The choose-your-own-adventure aspect can be frustrating. If you're trying to piece together a coherent model of exactly where the country is on green energy policy, good luck. But whatever you read of public sentiment, what is most striking about the news this week is not just that there is some new climate action on the table, but also how fast the landscape for climate policy has changed, shifting all of our standards for success and failure along with it. The bill may well prove inadequate, even if it passes. It also represents a generational achievement, achieved from the point of view of activists in a lot less time than a full generation. I will say this, it reminds me a great deal at a much larger and more important scale of what we did with filibuster reform, in the sense that, one, there was a very conscious decision to move to use an inside-outside strategy, which I don't know whether that's where David Dayen picked up that terminology. I don't know what else you would call it. It's not like it was a brilliant invention of a name, but that was an overt decision made by the people driving that effort. But also in how quickly we turned things around and how quickly we had to turn around stuff like, it was a couple of years between the entire journalistic and legislative and policy wonk establishment patting us on the head and saying, that's so cute. You just don't understand how things really work and how you actually make things change. And you just don't understand the rules. That's not really true. Everyone knows for a fact that this is not the way that thing works. And that's not the way we do things. That's not what that rule says. And no, you can't just. And the answer was yes, you can. And it's not an invention. It's from history. And not even long in the past. It was 25, 30 years ago you did this already. Many of you were in the Senate when you did it last time. But for some reason, everybody said, no, yeah, wouldn't that be nice? But no, that's not really the way things work. To retooling and reteaching the entire establishment to the point where they now finally understand that, yes, you can do these things. And now everybody's calling for carve-outs for this, that, and the other thing. Yes, it's difficult to do, but that would have been unthinkable at the time. But there was no money attached to that, by the way. I mean, if I had also gotten $350 billion somehow attached to that agenda, then you'd be talking about something. And we didn't do that. Ours was very heavily inside with a little bit of outside. This is very heavily outside with a lot of inside, too, plus billions and billions of dollars and saving the planet. So it's a bit of a bigger deal. But, there's a small level at which there's a parallel. Now back to his description of this. The present-day climate left was effectively born in the United States with the November 2018 Sunrise Movement sit-in. At the time, hardly anyone on the planet had heard of Greta Thunberg, who had just begun striking outside Swedish parliament, a lonely, socially awkward 15-year-old holding up a single sign. Not 4 years later, her existential rhetoric is routinely echoed by presidents and prime ministers and CEOs and secretaries general. And more than 80% of the world's economic activity and emissions are now, theoretically, governed by net zero pledges, pointing the way to a carbon-neutral future in just decades. These are mostly paper pledges at the moment, but the job of protesters is to force those in power first to write those checks, then apply pressure to see them cashed. In the United States, only a few years ago, hardly anyone had heard the phrase Green New Deal. 4 years later, egged on by activists, Jay Inslee pledged a $9 trillion climate plan in the Democratic primaries. Bernie Sanders one-upped him, suggesting $16 trillion. That's more than one up, but okay. While Biden's spending pledge was smaller at just $2 trillion, his emissions promise was broadly consistent with expectations coming out of the Paris Agreement to cut American emissions by half by the end of the decade and bring the country roughly in line with the promises of its wealthy peers. To trust the math of its architects, this deal between Manchin and the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer splits the difference. The United States won't be leading the pack on decarbonization, but it probably won't be seen by the rest of the world as a laughingstock or climate criminal either. None of this is exclusively the work of the climate left, of course. Technological progress has driven the cost of renewable energy down so quickly, it should now seem irresistible to anyone making long-term policy plans or public investments. There has been rapid policy innovation among centrists and policy wonks, too, dramatically expanding the climate toolkit beyond carbon taxes and cap-and-trade systems to what has been called a whole-of-government approach to decarbonizing. State commitments have been significant. In certain ways, Governor Gavin Newsom's $54 billion climate action plan for California is even more impressive than this grand federal bargain. Cultural shifts have been rapid, too, on electric vehicles and fossil fuel divestment, among other things, in part as a lagging reflection of more strident protest energy. In the private sector, businesses and investments are moving much faster, though still many more of them are delivering loose rhetorical promises than are truly putting their money where their emissions are. But if, a week ago, the story was an entire party mobilized to deliver major, if imperfect, progress, but lacking the support of one crucial senator, it would seem strange to lay the blame for that failure at the feet of those who'd done the mobilizing. And yet, that was one of the major memes of that brief, flagellating burst of reflection and self-criticism, that climate activists had pushed too hard, too angrily, and too unforgivingly, demanding of politicians more than politics allowed them to give, and dooming the efforts to failure. The most focused of that criticism was published by Noah Smith, formerly of Bloomberg. The quote being, "It is now abundantly clear that Americans are not going to support a big government push to rapidly decarbonize the U.S. economy," he wrote on July 20th. adding, "It is now time to conclude that the scare people into making a big push strategy that climate activists and leftists have been using over the last few years has decisively, utterly failed." Smith wasn't alone in faulting activists for pushing too hard. Justice or Overreach, a report by Zach Coleman in Politico, documented fears that social justice concerns among environmentalists may have doomed prospects for progress. In March, in an essay, Climate Politics for the Real World, Matt Iglesias wrote about, as he put it, what the Sunrise Movement and its boosters get wrong. Namely, that major progress could be achieved through a grassroots mobilization of the public rather than from above, inside baseball pressure on democratic elites. And as David pointed out, you need both. But as the political scientist Matto Mildenberger has pointed out, the legislation hadn't failed at the ballot box, it stalled on Manchin's desk. He also pointed to research showing climate is driving the voting behavior of Democrats much more than it is driving Republicans into opposition, and that most polling shows high levels of baseline concern about warming and climate policy all across the country. It is perhaps notable that as the Democrats were hashing out a series of possible compromises, there wasn't much noise about any of them from Republicans, who appeared to prefer to make hay about inflation, pandemic policy, and critical race theory. The rhetorical criticism was strange as well. Oh, wouldn't that be interesting? I'm going to pause for a second. The throwing in critical race theory at the end there. Wouldn't that be funny if we could somehow drive the narrative that that Chris Rufo and his critical race theory obsession, while he thought it was a huge victory and he was changing the face of American politics forever, was just like, yeah, well, if you let them scream about that, we can sneak by $350 billion in climate investment before they even know what hit them. That'd be an interesting way of putting it. It's your fault. You and your crazy CRT obsession let the entirety of the economy be reshaped while you weren't looking. Anyway, the rhetorical criticism was strange as well, especially as an indictment of the seeming failure of Biden's climate ambitions. It is not hard to talk about warming without evoking any fear, but the president was famous on the campaign trail and in office for saying, "When I think climate change, I think jobs." He did not say, "When I think climate change, I think wildfires and floods and droughts." He didn't say he thought about food security or about those drowning in basement apartments in New York City during storms or about climate justice. He didn't say he thought about the brutal impact of warming on the lives and livelihoods of those in the global south or how much guilt the average American should feel for the effects of our lifestyles on the world's poorest. He didn't mention degrowth. He didn't refer to the end of the world. He kept that kind of rhetoric about as far from his lips as anyone talking about climate possibly could have. He focused on green growth and the opportunities and benefits of a rapid transition. And while that might not itself have been all that surprising, the climate left didn't take it as a reason to put up a fight. In the primaries, Sunrise gave Biden an F for his climate plan, but after he sewed up the nomination, its co-founder, Varshini Prakash, joined his policy task force to help write his climate plan. As the plan evolved and shrank over time, there were squeaks and complaints here and there, but nothing like a concerted oppositional movement to punish the White House for its accommodating approach to political realities. And when activists did shout, the White House didn't bend over backward to accommodate them. The administration got behind the, what is this? It says 45Q tax credit. What is a 45Q tax credit? Oh, okay. It is the tax credit for carbon sequestration. It pushed for nuclear funding. It considered allowing new pipelines in exchange for Manchin's yes vote on the last bill, and seemingly willing to include new oil and gas exploration in the Gulf of Mexico in exchange for his support on this one. In fact, its current 725-page text includes a rule that the government can auction new offshore wind leases only if, within the past year, it also auctioned new oil and gas permits. And all of the above approach clearly out of line with the International Energy Agency's recommendation that no new investments in fossil fuel infrastructure can be made if the world is to hold on to the possibility of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels. From a hardline climate perspective, many of these concessions are imperfect and even counterproductive. But over the past 18 months, since the inauguration, whenever activists chose to protest, they were almost always protesting not the inadequacy of proposed legislation, but the worrying possibility of no legislation at all. When they showed up at Manchin's yacht, they were there to tell him not that they didn't want his support, but that they needed him to act. They didn't urge Biden to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They were urging him not to. When last week they thought they'd lost, Democratic congressional staff members staged an unprecedented sit-in at Schumer's office, hoping to pressure the Senate Majority Leader back into negotiations with Manchin. And what did they say? They didn't say, "We have 8 years to save the earth." They didn't say, "The blood of the future is on your hands." What their protest sign said was, "Keep negotiating, Chuck." As far as I can tell, this was code for "Give Joe more." They got their wish, and as a result, we got a bill. That's not naivete, but the opposite. Very interesting. Good perspective. You can't argue with it too much. A bill is in the offing. So I thought that was a very important, defense of climate activists, which is about as good a thing to include on a Friday as any. And, I would be inclined to share it at any time. But sometimes there are just too many other developments happening at any given time. There are a couple of other interesting things that I should share with you, but let's see. The break is coming. So, what can I use to fit in between now and the upcoming break? There's a couple of things. Well, let's see. I'll get off the climate subject for just a moment. And, I didn't get around to this, and this is like a small bore controversy, but I mentioned the other day the attack on Lee Zeldin and the odd discussion surrounding it. It was a very odd thing. You remember, this was the guy, this is the Republican nominee for governor in New York and a current Republican congressman, and, not somebody I follow very much, but there was a big splashy news headline about how he'd been attacked on stage. And this very weird discrepancy in the way in which things were attacked, where Democrats were saying, well, yeah, he was attacked. The guy got up on stage and tried to take the microphone from him. And the guy did have a weapon of sorts with him at the time, except, it wasn't an AR-15. But it also wasn't, a knife that he was, like the story came out, Zeldin saying, I was almost stabbed. Someone tried to assassinate me, come up and stab me and kill me on stage. And the guy had one of those cat face keychain things that basically doubles. It's not brass knuckles because it's not brass. It's made out of plastic. But it's pointy, and if you get punched with a person who's got it on their hand, you're going to get cut up. So that's bad. But the guy didn't throw a punch or anything. But on top of that, Lee Zeldin and the campaign made a very big deal out of his having been victimized here, and then saying, oh my God, I can't believe they released my attacker without bail so quickly after the attack. This was an assassination attempt. How dare you? And then it turns out that, hey, there are some weird details here, like, well, whose fault is it if somebody gets released without bail? Like, you might look to the judge and the prosecutor and say, well, what happened here that made you do this? And then when you do that, you find out, for instance, things like, well, the prosecutor in this case was the co-chair of Lee Zeldin's campaign. So to the extent that it's a terrible thing to do to release the guy without bail, maybe it's at your feet. But the fact that you're also, not just that you're a Republican, but that you're also like co-chair of the Lee Zeldin campaign, then makes people wonder, did you do this so that you could complain about, like, the liberal justice system isn't punishing anybody? Why did you agree? You had to agree that this person was going to be charged. You ended up charging him with second-degree attempted assault or something like that, a misdemeanor for which they didn't require any bail. But, I mean, you could have stood up and said, in the newspapers you were saying it was an assassination attempt, he had a knife, he was going to kill him, et cetera, et cetera. Then say so in court. But in court where it counts, you can't just exaggerate things into a bigger story. You gotta, you're accountable for what you say there as an officer of the court, and you were stuck with some lesser charge. Although you may have gone overboard and undercharged the guy so that you were engineering his release so that you could say how outrageous it was that liberal judges in the liberal justice system were letting criminals roam free, because that's just sort of fits with the Republican narrative. It's a little weird. I can share with you after the break a breakdown, a report on that from the New York Times. How did a man accused of attacking Lee Zeldin go free without bail? The decision to release the suspect was seen by some Democrats as a ploy to fuel Mr. Zeldin's anti-crime campaign as he runs for governor of New York. It's really kind of interesting, right? But of course, he's running for governor of New York on the anti-crime platform, meaning he's saying, I'll crack down and be tough on crime. Those liberals don't have it in them to do that, but I'll do it. And, they're releasing criminals left and right. And then in order to prove that they are releasing criminals left and right, well, he couldn't come up with an actual example that actually worked. So he decided, I'll release some criminals left and right, and then I'll show you. See, it really does happen. I knew I could prove it to you. Meh.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. What were we doing? What direction did I want to go? I was making all these decisions in the middle of these things here. But the Lee Zeldin thing. How did this guy end up going free? Let's just see if we can't read through this and get this on the record, because it's kind of weird. And the better we understand it, maybe the less the chance that Lee Zeldin would try something like this again. Jonah Bromwich and Jay Root reporting here for the New York Times on July 26th. It did not take long for the attack on Representative Lee Zeldin during a campaign event to become the latest flashpoint in the political fight over New York's bail laws. Hours after the attack last weekend, Mr. Zeldin, the Republican candidate for governor of New York, whose criticism over the Democrat-led changes to the bail statute has been a key issue in his campaign, said on Twitter that he expected the man arrested in the attack, David Jakubonis, Jakubonis. Don't know where the stress on that goes. He expected him to go free. He then spoke at length when his prediction came true, emphasizing in news conferences and television appearances how Mr. Jakubonis' release without bail exemplified the issues with the bail law. But almost immediately, the involvement of Mr. Zeldin's political allies prompted questions about the incident. Many Democrats seized on the relationship between the candidate and the Monroe County District Attorney, Sandra Durley, who, as recently as this week, was listed on Mr. Zeldin's website as campaign co-chair. They noted that the sheriff who filed the charge against Mr. Jakubonis, Todd K. Baxter of Monroe County, was also a vocal opponent of the bail law. And finally, they wondered why Mr. Jakubonis had been charged with second-degree attempted assault, a charge that is not bail eligible, virtually guaranteeing that he would be released as Mr. Zeldin had predicted. I would say, quote-unquote, predicted. I have no idea why a prosecutor would not charge with a more serious offense, said Charles D. Levine, a Democrat who serves as the chair of the Assembly's Judiciary Committee and is a former criminal defense lawyer. Here's a situation where someone attacks an elected official with a weapon. Could it have been, as some people are suggesting, that the charge was drafted in such a way to allow Zeldin to complain about the bail laws in the state of New York? That I don't know. State Assemblyman Demond Meeks, a Rochester Democrat, went even further, saying he was surprised at the lighter charge, given Ms. Dourley's reputation as an aggressive prosecutor, and said the affair was definitely a political ploy. No evidence has emerged to indicate that the charge was chosen to ensure Mr. Jakubonis' release, serving to amplify Mr. Zeldin's campaign message. Several criminal lawyers from Monroe County say the charge was fitting, given the particulars of the attack on July 21st. And in an interview, the investigating officer at the sheriff's office who filed the charge, Jeffrey Brannigan, said there had been no input from the district attorney's office other than to tell him that the charge was not eligible for bail. A spokesman for the sheriff's office, Sergeant Mike Zamiara, said Tuesday that the sheriff's office was aware of some controversy surrounding this case. He insisted, however, that the sheriff's office does not have a dog in this fight and we don't want to be in it. There was no attempt to influence anything here. A spokeswoman for Mr. Zeldin said in a statement that Ms. Dourley had not been involved in the charging decision. It's our understanding that DA Sandra Dourley is not, and will not be involved with the prosecution of this case due to her friendship with Congressman Zeldin, he said. The episode began at a campaign stop near Rochester on Thursday when a man, identified by the police as Jakubonis here, approached Mr. Zeldin as he was giving a speech. In a video of the encounter, Mr. Jakubonis appeared to put his left arm on the candidate's shoulder, then move his right hand, in which he was gripping a plastic pointed keychain shaped like a cat's head, in the direction of Mr. Zeldin's chest, saying, "You're done," several times. Mr. Zeldin appeared to hold him off easily, and the man was quickly tackled to the ground, bringing the candidate along with him. Mr. Jakubonis was charged by Sheriff Baxter's office later that evening. Zeldin was unharmed. Baxter has been outspoken in his opposition to changes in the state's bail law, which went into effect in early 2020 and have been since twice amended. Democrats passed the changes, which have prevented people from being held in jail for relatively minor crimes. More serious crimes, including violent crimes, remain bail eligible. The law's opponents have said the changes have led to increased crime, but data has not shown that to be the case. And researchers say that given the law coincided with the onset of the pandemic, it will be years before its full effect can be determined. But with some categories of crime rising, more people have been charged, released, and rearrested, providing ammunition to the law's critics. In November of 2019, Sheriff Baxter wrote an opinion piece calling on the state to reverse the statute before it went into effect and contending that the public will be shocked at the negative impact that this law will have on the safety of our communities. And the day after Mr. Jakubonis' attack, the sheriff announced on Twitter that he had cleared his calendar to discuss fixing criminal justice reforms with any state legislator who was interested. Mr. Brannigan said that he had not spoken to the sheriff before determining the charge to be filed against Mr. Jakubonis. He said that he had driven to the scene of the attack and had interviewed Mr. Zeldin as well as some of the staffers about what had happened. He had not previously spoken to Zeldin, a congressman representing Suffolk County on Long Island, and said he had not known who the candidate was. After completing his investigation, Mr. Brannigan made 3 calls to the DA's office. The first 2 were to Perry Duckles, some name, Perry Duckles, a deputy to Ms. Dourley, whom Mr. Brannigan informed that he planned to file a charge of attempted assault in the 2nd degree. At the time of their second call, Mr. Duckles had just been informed that 2 police officers had been shot in Rochester. So he asked Mr. Brannigan to direct further conversations about the case to Matthew Schwartz, the chief of the district attorney's major felony unit. During a conversation with Mr. Schwartz, Mr. Brannigan confirmed with Schwartz that the charge was not bail eligible. Brannigan said that it was not unusual in Monroe County for the sheriff's office to file such charges without a prosecutor present, and lawyers who practiced in criminal court there agreed. Still, the district attorney's ties to Zeldin have come under scrutiny. In this case, Callie Marianetti, a spokeswoman for Ms. Durley, said that the district attorney was not personally involved in any conversations about the charge against Mr. Jakubonis and, as of Friday, had decided to recuse herself from the case. Zeldin on Monday claimed that Durley had recused herself in an instant decision after the attack, according to the Albany Times-Union. Maybe, maybe not. Ms. Marianetti added that Ms. Durley had stopped advising Zeldin's campaign in the spring. She said that because there had never been any paperwork formalizing Ms. Durley's role, there had been no official withdrawal from the campaign. In an email statement on Thursday, Ms. Durley's office said it had informed Zeldin of her decision not to be involved in his campaign on April 28th. But up until this week, I guess she was on the website. Defense attorneys and former prosecutors who practice in Monroe County said the attempted assault charge is fitting given the specifics of the attack, and said they saw nothing overly suspicious about the circumstances in which it was filed. Jill Paperno, who worked as a public defender in Monroe County for 35 years before leaving for private practice, said that the charge of attempted assault made sense given that the pointed keychain he was holding did not look capable of causing the serious physical injury that would be required for a higher degree of assault. In New York, serious physical injury means a substantial risk of death is created, or the possibility of disfigurement or impairment of a bodily organ. Donald Thompson, partner at the firm of Easton, Thompson, Kasperek, Schifrin, why am I even wasting my time on this, and a criminal defense lawyer, agreed that the charge accurately reflected the allegations, that it was not particularly lenient, and it was not unusual for the two agencies to discuss the charges beforehand. I mean, I don't need to say the firm's name and struggle. Anyway, asked if it could have been coordinated to the benefit of Mr. Zeldin, Thompson was contemplative. As a political consideration, could that have happened? I think we can't rule it out. Is there any evidence of that? Not that I'm aware of. But certainly people who are so inclined in that direction would make that argument, because we don't get to pull back the curtain. You can't say that's why it happened or that isn't why it happened. Mr. Jakubonis has since been charged federally with assaulting a member of Congress using a dangerous weapon. He has been held in federal custody since Saturday. A detention hearing is scheduled for Wednesday. So the federal government is doing more anyway, I guess, that takes the wind out of the sails anyway of Zeldin and his claim that nobody ever does anything. But it's highly suspicious, and I just thought that should be on the record. And Friday's a good time for it. You know what? I have another item that I really think would make a great addition, because Mark Elias and Democracy Docket did a great explainer yesterday of the hearing in the issues involved in the Pennsylvania elections case. I made brief mention of it a little while ago, and we were kind of puzzled. And this really does pull back the curtain and make some sense out of this controversy. We heard that there were 3 Pennsylvania counties that were refusing to report their results in a conclusive way of a Republican primary contest. And it was left to our imagination just what the hell was going on here, because it was a contest between the state officials who were saying you got to count your ballots and give us the numbers, and then 3 counties saying, oh, something, something, vague notions of voter fraud because of something, absentee ballots, yada, yada. And it was like, what's going on here? We have rogue counties. Is this like those weird rogue counties in the 2020 election? They were trying to decertify votes so that, because they were claiming Detroit as a whole was corrupt and therefore we're not counting any ballots from Detroit. What is going on here? Well, the hearing really clarifies things. And, I come down in favor of the side I thought I would be in favor of. But all of a sudden I had some understanding of, okay, it's not entirely crazy that these counties are doing this. They're not just saying, we lost and so we want to reverse the results. That was never going to be the case, in that it was a primary election for the Republicans. So what was going on? I think this is a great explainer of it. Democracy Docket is the tweeter here, I think so. I think that's Mark Elias's organization, but they were, and I don't know if it was him tweeting, but they were tweeting in an official capacity, I guess, following this Pennsylvania hearing. And it just kicks off here with a, starting soon court hearing regarding the refusal to count valid, undated mail-in ballots in a primary race in 3 Pennsylvania counties. So here's what's going on. Attorneys representing the counties. Here, I'll read his one of the tweets in this thread. We'll just read through the thread. Attorneys representing the counties make their opening statements and argue that there's no case or controversy before the court, meaning that they believe the state doesn't have standing to even bring this lawsuit. The state at this point is suing the 3 counties to give us your numbers. The county is essentially saying, we did give you our numbers, but the state is saying, yes, but you gave us the wrong numbers because you have a different standard for counting mail-in ballots than the rest of the state. We want you to count them the way the rest of the state does. That's the basics of it. An attorney representing Pennsylvania makes an opening statement and says, this is not a case to enforce guidance from the Secretary of the Commonwealth to count these ballots. This is a case to enforce an order of this court, state law and federal law. You'll see how in just a minute. The state calls Jonathan Marks, the Deputy Secretary for Elections and Commissions at the Pennsylvania Department of State, or DOS, as its first witness. Marks is describing the responsibilities of county boards of elections and the DOS during elections. Marks says that the Board of Elections, or BOE, are expected, but not required, to follow guidance from the DOS, Department of State, about elections. Marks further explains that the courts have final say over questions regarding election administration, and DOS provides guidance consistent with court decisions. Marks explains election canvassing, which includes counting ballots and tabulating totals. The state attorney asks, does the Secretary of State ensure that her certification is accurate and complete? Marks replies, yes, she does. Moving on to mail-in ballots, Marks explains that the envelope for mail-in ballots includes a spot for voters to handwrite a date. The date, presumably the date you filled out the ballot and returned it. Attorney asks Marks if counties use this date to determine whether the ballot was returned on time. But Marks says no. There is no administrative purpose for the date written by the voter. In other words, what ends up happening here, in case this isn't clear, it's clear when you read it as a whole, but when you fill out your absentee ballot in Pennsylvania, you're supposed to sign and date the envelope the ballot goes in. You're probably also signing and dating the ballot inside. And then you send it in. Now, you'll find out later, probably in this next one, here it is, that counties use a date stamp on the outer envelope. Every time one of these envelopes comes in, somebody has to stamp it with the date. And the counties use that stamped date to determine if ballots were received on time, not the date written by the voter. So, as he says, the written date has no administrative purpose whatsoever. They don't use it to decide whether the vote was cast in time. They don't use it to decide whether the vote was received on time. They don't use it for anything. It's just there as a requirement, and that's all. No real reason for it. So, counties date stamp the envelope, and Marks explains that voters often write the wrong date on the envelope, which is why they don't use it for anything. You could, like, if you think, they're going to think I'm a slacker for voting on the 5th, I'll backdate it to the 4th or the 3rd or something like that. So you could write anything. So they don't use it for anything. All it is, if it arrives in their office, they stamp it with the date that it arrived, and that is what's determinative in the state or in the county boards of elections. So they often write, and that's part of the reason, they often write the wrong date. It can't be relied on. What sorts of wrong dates? Could there be, trying to backdate it? Yes, they could. But also, fairly frequently, people are like, I'm signing and dating it, and they'll either unconsciously or they'll think that this is what's required of them for whatever reason. They'll sign it and then put their date of birth rather than the day they completed the ballot. Some voters fail to write a date on the envelope entirely. This creates two categories of ballots that boards of election deal with: wrongly dated and undated ballots. Now, Marks explains that since September of 2020, the state's guidance has been that counties cannot and should not set aside ballots that are wrongly dated, because who cares, right? They get stamped. That's the date that's determinative. Meaning a ballot that has an incorrect date, whether it's a birth date or some other error made by the voter, whatever it is. They wrote the wrong date, they wrote the date backwards, doesn't matter. It's date stamped anyway. It's fine. Don't use the wrong date to exclude a ballot. Now, in regards to undated ballots, the Department of State's guidance going into the May 2022 primary, this one, was that undated ballots should not be counted. Okay? The Department of State tells the boards of election they shouldn't be counted, which is fine for these three counties because these three counties are actually not counted. But what happens here? That's the guidance. However, after state and federal court decisions said that undated ballots should be counted, someone sued and said the Department of State is wrong here. They should be issuing guidance that says count them. And then the courts agreed. And once the court agreed, at that point, the Department of State changed its guidance to match the court rulings. They were in compliance with the court rulings. So Marks sent notice to all the county boards of election on June 17th, 2022, explaining the recent court decisions and saying that the counties should canvass, tabulate, and certify votes from undated ballots if they had not already done so. That's the new guidance. Now, the relevant cases involving undated mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania are listed here. There's a Migliori versus Lehigh County Board of Elections, where the Third Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the undated ballots should be counted. There's also a McCormick versus Chapman, where the Commonwealth Court, the same court that this hearing was held in yesterday, ordered undated ballots to be counted in the Republican U.S. Senate primary. After multiple reminders, Berks, Lancaster, and Fayette counties remained the only counties that failed to count and include undated mail-in ballots from the primary totals. All counties included wrongly dated ballots in their totals. The attorney for Berks and Lancaster counties now begins to question Marks. The attorney for the counties asks Marks if the voter declaration for mail-in ballots says, does it or does it not say, sir, that, quote, the ballot will not be counted unless the ballot is signed and dated in the voter's own handwriting? Well, Marks confirms that it does. Well, the Berks and Lancaster counties now ask, does the department recognize that the canvassing and counting of absentee ballots is discretionary? Marks says, well, I think the mechanics of it are discretionary. Whether or not to count legally cast ballots, that's not discretionary. That's a duty. Good point, right? The attorney for Berks and Lancaster says that Berks, Lancaster, and Fayette counties submitted certified election results in early June. So what's the why? What are you suing us for? We gave you our certified results. But Marks says, well, it's the Department of State's position that the counties did not submit complete certification totals since those submitted results did not include undated ballots. You see what's happening here? The counties are saying, look, the plain language of the instructions on the ballot say that the ballots will not be counted unless they are signed and dated in handwriting by the voter. And we have ballots that are not signed and dated by the voter. It says they're not going to be counted. The voters shouldn't expect that they're going to be counted, given that it says right on the ballot that they won't be counted. That's not a terribly unreasonable position, but it becomes unreasonable when, as they point out in the answers, yes, well, we printed them, and when we printed them, That was the rule. That was the one we decided on. The Department of State agreed with you at that point. But then the courts were asked to intervene. And in between the time that we printed the ballots and then held the election, the state and federal courts intervened and said, if there's no administrative purpose whatsoever to the date, if you can write the wrong date and have it counted, what's the point of writing the date at all? And if there's no point of writing the date at all, then don't worry about it. All you need to know is, did they come in on time? And that's taken care of by the date stamping. So forget the line where they have to write the date. If they write the date wrong, you're going to count it. So what's wrong if they wrote it correctly, but they wrote it in invisible ink, you would count it. I mean, what's the point? If there's no administrative purpose, there's no authentication whatsoever that's dependent on what the person writes, then who cares whether they write it or not? That was the decision of the court. And even if you disagree with the decision of the court, that was it. There was a court order that said, you got to count these ballots. So what you have is ballots that say they won't be counted, and then after that, in time, a court order that says they must be counted, and then after that, guidance from the state that says the courts say you got to count them, so we expect you to count them. And then these three counties say, but we don't like that court's decision, so we're not going to count them. Well, that's where you run into trouble. You see? Okay, so, I mean, yeah, and it's so funny. You run into this thing all the time. Like, people will say, I've got eyes. I can see that this says that the ballot won't be counted unless it's signed and dated by the voter. And that's all we did. And it's like, well, you got to keep up with what the courts say about these things. Well, how am I? I'm just a layman and a part-time worker at the Board of Elections. How am I supposed to keep up with this? Well, that's where the Department of State guidance comes in. You should take Department of State guidance seriously because they endeavor to truthfully and seriously inform you quickly in easy to understand ways what you should be doing if it departs at all from the obvious interpretation of what's written, which this does. We'll send you a note. Courts say this part of what's printed on the ballot is inoperative now. All that matters is the date stamp. So just follow that. 3 counties said, we're not gonna. So Marks continues in his testimony here. It was our determination, based on the case law, that counties had a duty to certify results that included undated ballots, and that failing to do so would mean that the counties have not completed their statutory duty to certify votes from all legally cast ballots. Now, there's a separate attorney. Fayette County brings their own attorney here. And the attorney for Fayette County asks Marks if the Secretary of the Commonwealth has the authority to ask the court to order counties to include undated mail-in ballots in the results. The state here objects, and the judge says, well, that's a legal question for the court to decide, not Marks, the guy from the Department of State. The Fayette attorney asks Marks to confirm that the county has certified their election results. Don't you agree? They sent their election results, but Marks says, no. It's the Department of State's position that the counties have not properly certified their election results because they've refused to include undated mail-in ballots. Earlier, Marks said he's not aware of any administrative use for the handwritten date because counties time-stamp the ballots when they're received to determine if they were in on time. The Fayette attorney argues that the handwritten date prevents fraud in some way, and apparently provides a bizarre hypothetical, but there's no description of what the hypothetical is. But that's their claim. Well, the date has to be written there, and it's really, I mean, at the best thing they can say about that is it's one of those "Are you a bot?" tests. The instructions say sign it and date it. If they don't sign it and date it, then it might be somebody, it's a bot, or I don't know, whatever it is, or it's just somebody faking signatures. Well, then check the signature. The date won't help you with that. But he just says, well, it will. All right, so where were we here? They have a break. They come back from the thing here. The The ballots at hand, it says here, were mail-in ballots cast by eligible voters and returned on time. They're just missing this handwritten date on the outer envelope. State and federal courts said that shouldn't matter. The vote should count. Even if, we told you, even if they write the wrong date, these counties will count them. Now, the Fayette attorney asks Marks a few quick questions and wraps up. And then the trial continues, or the hearing continues from there. What's really interesting, though, is that it goes on, and I'm running out of time here, but it goes on to point out that the attorneys for the counties are basically standing there and saying the reason we refuse to comply with the court order to include the ballots that are not dated by hand is that we didn't like the ruling. We didn't like the outcome. And now remember, it was this very court, not maybe necessarily this judge, but it could have been this judge, who issued that order and said you have to count them. And they're saying, well, we didn't count them because we didn't actually like your decision. And the judge is sort of very calmly says, well, you know, I stand by the decision, and this is my court. So anyway, we'll be continuing on here. But it's their position that people who the court said had cast legal ballots didn't have to have their ballots counted. Because, why? Because it says here, printed right on the thing, that they have to date it. Yes, well, you've been given a court order. Yeah, well, then they should have printed new ballots. Well, no, they didn't have time to print new ballots. You were sent guidance by the state. Anyway, it was a very interesting explanation. You should read it for yourself. I'll provide it to you. Mostly because it finally made some sense of what were these guys saying. Why were they saying that they didn't have to do what the state said or didn't have to count every ballot? The only thing is it all breaks down over why anybody is asked to date a ballot at all in the first place if you're just going to timestamp it anyway. It's just weird and interesting. You could see how the controversy could arise. But now you've got a court order. Follow it.
NetworksRadio.com.
You can't just say I don't like it.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Anyway, a very small bore case, but this is the foundation for local boards of election then claiming that there's fraud. They find something to hang their hat on, and then they just say, well, if the law says the opposite, I don't like it, and that's enough for me. Not going to work out. Small bore case, but very important to the larger picture. Stay tuned. Justice is next.